Hi everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day so far. In this video, we will be continuing to discuss the case of Fred and Rose West. This video is part 2 of this case, so I would highly suggest heading over to part 1 and watching that first if you haven't already. You can see a link to this in the upper corner of the screen right now, but I am going to give a little explanation of where we have got to so far, just to jog your memory, after I've mentioned my usual disclaimers. This video contains topics which may be distressing to some viewers. These topics include child abuse, essay of adults and minors, torture, internal family relations, and murder. There may be further topics included which I have missed here, so viewer discretion is definitely advised. We're going to be covering a lot of heavy topics today, so if that's something you don't think would be suitable for you, please feel free to click off the video and hopefully I can see you again when we're talking about a topic which might be more suitable for you. I would also like to quickly mention that all of the information we'll be talking about today has come from research which I have conducted through sources which are readily available on the internet. No disrespect is intended with this presentation in any way, it's all for educational purposes only. I do try to get all of the information correct to the best of my ability, but I do apologise if there are any mistakes at all. So in part 1 of the case, we discussed the life and childhood of both Fred and Rose West. Both people had quite a rocky childhood, with Rose being the victim of SA from her father from a very young age. Both Fred and Rose were said to exhibit concerning behaviours regarding sexuality from a young age, with Rose walking around the house naked and essaying her brothers, and Fred essaying his younger sister and also other women. Fred had been married to a woman named Rena, who he had had 2 children with, a stepdaughter named Charmaine and a biological daughter named Anne-Marie. During this time, one of Fred's pregnant affair partners, 16-year-old Anne McFall, mysteriously vanished, which later it sadly comes to light that Fred had taken her life. Fred and Rose met when Fred was 28 and Rose was only 15 years old. They got into a relationship very quickly, with Rose having their first child together when she was aged only 16, and they named this daughter Heather Ann. Sadly, when Fred was in prison, his stepdaughter Charmaine lost her life, aged only 8 years old, by the hands of Rose. Charmaine's mother Rena also lost her life shortly after when she came looking for her daughter. We finished off part 1 by discussing how Rose had begun to sell sexual services in the family home and have given birth to a total of 8 children from different fathers who were her clients. So, after having this quick rundown of what occurred in part 1, we will now continue with the rest of the case. So now we're getting on to the first recorded non-family victim of Fred and Rose, and this was 17-year-old Carolyn Owens. She originally came into contact with the couple when they picked her up whilst hitchhiking in October of 1972. It was from here that they offered her a job as a nanny for their children when she expressed needing work during a conversation that they had had. Caroline said she noticed the strange obsession that the couple seemed to have with sex, which made her really uncomfortable, especially when they'd invited her to partake in the acts with them, and she did decline this, of course. This action prompted her to stop actually working with the family as the nanny, but sadly, Caroline was picked up by the couple again whilst hitchhiking along her usual route. It seemed that she took this hitchhiking route quite often. I'm not sure whether it was, I think I saw something about to and from a boyfriend's house, like from a boyfriend's to home. I could be wrong, don't quote me on that, but I think that's what I saw references saying. So it was quite common that she did hitchhike this route, which was very common back in where this was the 70s and stuff, to hitchhike a lot. And here they pretended that they wanted to apologise to her by giving her a lift home. During this lift, it was where the couple abducted Caroline. They punched her, which knocked her out, before subjecting her to hours of SA. The next day, she was asked to return to working as the family's nanny, which of course she agreed to in order to formulate an escape plan for herself. This choice likely saved her life, as she was eventually able to escape from the clutches of the family whilst out at laundrettes or laundromats with Rose. From here, she was able to return home to her mother, but it did take quite a while for Caroline to be able to tell her mother about the horrors she endured due to the immense fear and trauma that she had experienced from this. But she finally did open up when her mother expressed concern for all of the injuries she had. The assault was reported to police, which resulted in both Fred and Rose being arrested. But sadly, Caroline felt that she couldn't face the couple in court. This led the trial that was planned to be cancelled. And because it was cancelled and she couldn't face them in court, the couple only got a £50 fine. And I worked this out, it's approximately £826 today. So they got off with absolutely no punishment for the abduction and torture and essay of this young girl. But luckily, she did manage to escape with her life. The murderous acts of the couple only continued in 1973 when 19-year-old Linda Goff became acquaintances of the couple when she began seeing two of the male lodgers who lived in the upstairs room of their home. So if you remember, they rented out the upstairs rooms in the house to as bed sits for people so they could pay to have a bed to sleep in. So she was seeing two of the men that were living in that bed sit. Linda was said to also move into the West home around the 19th of April 1973, but she was never seen again after this date. Fred and Rose stated that they had kicked Linda out of the house as she had hit their children. This story was also told to Linda's mother when she contacted them wondering where her daughter had vanished to. Sadly, Linda had been murdered by Fred and Rose. I'm not sure of the details of how this actually occurred, but I saw some references mentioning possible asphyxiation by suffocation, so I'm not 100% sure, but that's what some references said, so it could have been that. Her body was later found with surgical tape wrapped around her skull, which would have originally been wrapped around her mouth so that she couldn't scream. She had straws inserted into her nose so that she could get a little bit of air to breathe, and her limbs were dismembered. Her body was missing 5 cervical vertebrae, and these vertebrae are the ones in the neck. There's a total of 7 vertebrae in the neck, so she was missing 5 out of the 7 vertebrae in her neck. She was also missing her patella, which are the bones in the knee. You know, the one you can feel when you touch your knee. It's that bone. And she was missing several finger bones as well. She was found buried in the garage of the house in a pit which used to be a mechanic's inspection pit. It's one of those pits, you know, where you drive your car over it and then you can go into the pit and kind of like look up. I'm guessing they had one of those in the garage, but they put her body in there and obviously filled it up. Later on in 1973, on the 10th of November, Carol Ann Cooper was waiting for a bus in either Warndon, which is approximately 50 minutes away from the West's home, or Cheltenham, which is around 30 minutes away. I saw some sources say both of the areas, so I'm not sure exactly which one it is that she was in at this time. I'm not sure why the sources were so conflicting with this, but we do know that she was waiting for a bus in one of those areas. Carol was only 15 years old, and she was on her way home from the movie theatre after spending the evening there with her boyfriend. It's suspected that Fred had noticed Carol alone at the bus stop and dragged her into his car, abducting her. From here, her face was wrapped in surgical tape just like Linda, and her arms were bound with braided cloth for added strength. It was after this horrifying abduction that she was driven back to the West's house, where she was subsequently SA'd before sadly passing away due to asphyxiation from strangulation, just like Linda had. With Linda, I couldn't find sources saying that was definitely the case, but I saw some saying that it could have been the case, so just keep that in mind as well. Like all of the other victims so far, her body was dismembered. At the time of her disappearance, Carol was living at the Pine Children's Home in Worcester and had been granted permission to stay with her grandmother for the weekend when she was sadly abducted and lost her life at the hands of Fred West. I'm not 100% sure if Rose West was involved in this abduction and murder, and if so, the extent of this. Most of the sources only mentioned Fred, and I couldn't find any references stating that she was definitely involved, but of course, the girl was brought back to their home together. So I feel like it could be safe to assume that she probably definitely knew about it, even if she wasn't involved. Very shortly after the disappearance and death of Carol, 21-year-old Lucy Partington was abducted by Fred West on the 27th of December 1973. She again was waiting for a bus home, and this was after spending time with friends and family over Christmas. It's believed that Lucy was sadly SA'd and tortured at the hands of the Wests for approximately a full week prior to her death. It's believed that this occurred because Fred had taken himself to the hospital a week after her abduction on the 3rd of January 1974, and he took himself to hospital with a really deep cut to his hand. Evidence suggests that he likely sustained this injury whilst in the process of dismembering Lucy's body, as a knife matching the one which would have likely created Fred's hand wound was found alongside her body when she was later found during police investigations. Lucy was in her final year of her English literature degree at the University of Exeter when she was abducted and murdered by the Wests. She had a really fulfilling life ahead of her, and her younger sister has since expressed that she was really missed by everyone in the family. I saw a news article where there was an interview with her younger sister as well, and sadly she went to, I guess, once her body was found, her sister went and actually collected her her bones, which I found really upsetting, so that the family could bury them. She went and actually physically handled them herself, which must have been really, really hard to do. I think it was her choice to do so, but she did go and actually physically handle her sister's body, which is really, really upsetting. It's really sad to think about having to do that. Just 4 months later, on the 16th of April 1974, 21-year-old Therese Seigenthaler was abducted by the Wests whilst hitchhiking to Ireland. Therese was a Swiss student studying sociology in the UK. She was reported missing by a family in Switzerland when they hadn't heard from her in a long while. Sadly, once again, she was killed by the Wests after suffering horrific abuse, just like all of the other victims. Her body was said to have been buried in the West's home, with a fake chimney breast built over where her remains were to further hide her body. And I couldn't find much more information on Therese. Some of the victims I found was quite difficult to find a lot of information on. I'm guessing some of them wanted to remain, like some of the families wanted them to remain as private as possible, which is completely understandable, and I fully respect that. So, I tried to include as much that I could, but I just want you to keep in mind that some of the victims I couldn't find much on. On the 15th of November 1974, 15-year-old Shirley Hubbard was abducted by the Wests from a bus stop whilst on her way home from a work experience at Debenhams. And Debenhams, if you don't know, was like a department store in the UK. It has since ceased trading. There's no Debenhams anymore. But she was doing work experience at this store. Her disappearance was reported to police, who later found her body in the cellar/basement area of the West house. Her head had been covered up in tape just like Linda had, and a small straw was up her nose, providing a breathing hole. Juanita Mott was sadly the next victim of the Wests on the 12th of April 1975, and she was just 18 at the time. She had previously lived as a tenant in one of the rooms in the West's household, but has since moved out to live with a family friend. But when hitchhiking back to a friend's house where she was currently living, she failed to return home the following day when she was supposed to, so was reported as missing. It was 3 years later when the West's next victim sadly lost her life. 18-year-old Shirley Robinson was 8 months pregnant with Fred's child when she disappeared on the 10th of May 1978. It's mentioned in some sources that her murder wasn't for sexual purposes like the other young women and girls. It was due to Rose being unhappy with Shirley's pregnancy with Fred's baby, which I found really ironic, seeing as she had had children with several different men throughout their time being married. And this was said to have put a really big strain on their relationship. Other sources stated that they had actually planned to sell the baby to a childless couple when she gave birth, but I couldn't find any proof of this, so do take it with a grain of salt. It was just one or two sources that said this. Shirley's body was later found by police in the back garden of the West home underneath the patio. 16-year-old Alison Chambers was training to be a solicitor when she went missing on the 5th of August 1979. She originally was reported as missing as a runaway from foster care, but sadly her dismembered remains were found at the West house in the garden later on. As was the case with many of the other victims, her body was dismembered and several of her bones were missing. She was said to have been found with a leather belt looped around a mandible or lower jaw, and it was tied at the top of her head. I'm guessing that was to keep her mouth closed, just like they did with the tape. They wrapped that around the victims' faces. I'm guessing that this belt situation was also to stop her from being able to scream or something. I'm not sure, but that is just my guess on the situation. Alison is said to be the final victim which was killed for sexual purposes, but sadly she wasn't the overall final victim. The final victim of Fred and Rose West was their own daughter, 16-year-old Heather Ann West. On the 18th of June, 1987, Heather had just received a rejection letter for a job at a holiday camp. Heather had just graduated from high school and had been hoping desperately for this job so that she could escape from the clutches of her family and start life over on her own where she could finally be safe. This rejection letter absolutely broke her hopes and dreams of ever being able to escape, leading her to break down in tears. Her siblings report that she spent the whole night sobbing, and in the morning she just looked incredibly miserable and anxious, and it's so sad what happened. Her siblings went to school, but when they returned, Heather was gone. Sadly, 16-year-old Heather had her life taken from her by her own parents. And these are the people you expect to love and take care of you, but these children never got to experience any kind of love and respect from their parents in any way. It must have been such a horrible, horrible upbringing. It's awful to hear what these kids went through, and sadly, yet another child of theirs has lost their life. First Charmaine, and now Heather. Fred and Rose told the children that Heather had left to accept the job, even though Heather had already told her siblings that she'd been rejected for the position. Yet they'd told neighbours that Heather had run away from home after getting into a heated argument with them. This lie lasted for years, with the siblings never hearing from Heather again. They did question this, but they were told she had eloped with a lesbian lover. I don't know why it had to be... do you know what I mean? Like, why did they have to make that up? It's just so strange that they just made up that she had eloped with a lesbian lover that she had. There was no proof that Heather was lesbian or anything, but for some reason they just jumped to that and decided to say that that was what happened to her. It just seems such a strange thing to jump to, in my opinion. This was then changed to an excuse that Heather was involved in credit card fraud, when May and Stephen suggested contacting the police about Heather's disappearance. And I guess the siblings didn't go ahead with contacting the police because they didn't want to potentially get Heather in trouble for this if she really had run away, because she committed fraud or something. They wanted to keep their sister safe. That is my guess. The cracks in the story did begin to show even more over time, as Fred was found telling the kids that they would end up buried under the garden patio like Heather. Luckily, suspicion began to arise even more when Fred and Rose continued to change excuses as to where Heather was. This all came to a head in 1992 when 13-year-old Louise West, one of the West's daughters, told a close friend about the SA she had been experiencing from her parents. This friend relayed what Louise had told her to her own mother, who promptly reported this to the police. An investigation was started straight away into the SA of Louise, which resulted in a search of the house on the 6th of August 1992, during which a large number of fetish items were found. 13-year-old Louise had also made a full statement against her parents, reporting the years of SA she had experienced at the hands of them. During the statement, she mentioned her parents' little jokes about Heather being buried under the patio, and how she would have to join her sister if she told anyone what was happening at home. Luckily, this time, these weren't taken as jokes by the police, and a full-scale investigation was launched into the disappearance of 16-year-old Heather West, whilst both Fred and Rose went up for trial for SA of their children. Sadly, the initial trial for the SA of the children collapsed as Louise and Anna Marie, which were the two daughters, no longer wanted to testify against them. Luckily, police had already been looking into the whereabouts of Heather, as well as noticing that Catherine and Charmaine were actually unable to be accounted for as well. So they're finally putting the dots together that all of these people that were involved or were part of the family, they've only, kind of realised that family members are missing now. On the 24th of February 1994, yes, this was a full 2 years after the initial report of the SA from Louise, police presented a search warrant to Rose, which allowed them to search the property. They began digging up the garden, finding nothing on the first day, but when they returned the next morning, Fred told them that he would give a full confession for the murder of his daughter, Heather West. He did this at 11:15 a.m. on the 25th of February 1994. During this confession, he detailed to police how he had killed his 16-year-old daughter by strangling her in a fit of rage and then dismembering her body in the downstairs bathroom. He also adamantly claimed that Rose was completely unaware of the death of Heather and had absolutely no involvement with it whatsoever. Heather's body was sadly discovered on the 26th of February at approximately 4 p.m. and was identified later that same day via dental records. But she was found in an area of the garden where Fred had insisted they wouldn't find her, which is really weird why he would lead them to the wrong place. Her body was found with remnants of plastic bin liners, and she had several bones missing, just like I mentioned had happened to several of the other victims. This included a patella, which I mentioned was a knee bone, and some finger bones. Her fingernails were also said to be found in a pile next to her body, suggesting that they had been torn from her hands before her death as a possible form of torture, which was really hard for me to read. It sounds so painful. So painful. Upon the discovery of Heather's remains, police also found the femur or thigh bone of another human, which led the police to realise that there may be even more victims than just Heather within the garden. This prompted them to ask Fred about the possibility of other victims, which he fully admitted to police over the course of the next few days, also notifying them of the further bodies he had buried in the cellar of the home. When forensics examined the crime scene in the basement, where the victims were often held while they were being essayed, they noticed that there were holes drilled into the beams of the ceiling. It was believed that these holes were used to chain up the victims during their assaults so that they couldn't resist what was happening to them. Within the next few months, a total of 12 bodies were found within the address of 25 Cromwell Street, where the Wests lived, and also in a field where Fred buried Rena West. When the body of Charmaine West was found, who was Fred's stepdaughter with Rena, if you remember, it was found that her body had been severed at the hip, with several bones, including fingers, wrists, and ankle bones missing, which is presumed to have been because they were taken as keepsakes, which seems to be a common thing with here. I don't think any of the missing bones have actually been found for any of these victims, I couldn't see reports of that happening. So I'm not exactly sure where these bones were kept or what happened to them. But it is believed that they were kept as keepsakes. But obviously, I don't think it can be proved because I don't think they were ever actually found. But if it can't be a coincidence that all of the same kind of bones, the finger, the kneecaps, things like that, keep just not turning up with the bodies. You know what I mean? It seems strange that they always end up missing. Even though Fred was adamant that Rose had absolutely no involvement in any of the murders, police arrested her on the 20th of April 1994. This was initially for the SA of an 11-year-old girl and an 8-year-old boy in the 1970s. I believe they may have made this arrest so they could make sure that she was in custody whilst they gathered evidence of her involvement in the murders. During this time, she was extensively interviewed about the murders, but claimed she was innocent the whole time. On the 6th of May 1994, both Fred and Rose were jointly charged for 5 counts of murder. This was then increased to 12 counts of murder for Fred and 9 counts of murder for Rose. And this was during their formal trial on the 30th of June 1994. It's said that during the time in prison awaiting their sentencing, Rose completely ignored all attempts of communication through letters sent by Fred, and this led him to becoming extremely depressed and angry. He then decided to take back his earlier confessions where he claimed he acted alone and that Rose was completely innocent, and instead claimed she was involved in all of the murders committed. I saw some sources saying that she tried to ignore him because she thought that would make her look more innocent if she didn't want anything to do with him after she, quote-unquote, found out about it, if you know what I mean. I think that was more of an act than anything. I mean, I can't prove this, but that is my personal belief. I think it was an act that she just thought in a little head that if she pretended that she was now disgusted with her husband after she found out about the murders, that it would make her look innocent. On the 1st of January 1995, Fred West was found deceased in his cell, aged 55. He had taken his own life by strangling himself with a rope constructed from a blanket, and therefore Fred was frustratingly never officially sentenced for his crimes. It was just like the initial, like pre-trials or whatever were completed. And so I don't want to say he got away with the crime. Well, he did. He got away with committing 12 murders, basically. He never faced it. He never faced it, did he? Really? Apparently he was even originally on, all I can say is self-death, if you know what I mean. I can't say the word. So he was originally even on self-death watch. Like I said, I'm unable to say the actual name of this, so I apologise, when he was first imprisoned. But these restrictions were relaxed shortly before he did die, as it was believed he was no longer a threat to himself. Although Fred was now deceased, it didn't mean that Rose would get away with the murders like she seemingly believed she would. Even though there is said to have been no DNA evidence implicating Rose with the murders, her trial began on the 3rd of October 1995. And this is like the official sentencing trial. The prosecutor explained to the court how the Wests were both sex-obsessed, sadistic murderers, pointing out that Fred was actually in prison when 8-year-old Charmaine West lost her life in 1971. Which is said to have been backed up by witness testimonies from neighbours. So I'm guessing neighbours told them that, yeah, we stopped seeing Charmaine, and then Fred was in prison at this time, so, you know, how was she completely uninvolved with everything when this little girl disappeared whilst Fred was literally locked away? So it kind of, you know, you can't argue with that at this point. One witness even stated that during the time being Fred's appointed appropriate adult, and this is a kind of support person who's given to someone who is considered to be mentally unwell or vulnerable during a court case. So I think this is given to every person that requires it in the UK. So during that time being an appointed appropriate adult for Fred, he had confessed to them that he had agreed with Rose to take all of the blame for the murders in the hope that she would actually be able to walk free. I'm just so glad, it's so lucky that this didn't happen. And she didn't get away with this, because could you imagine if she managed to get away with this and no one would ever know? That is really scary to think about. But like I said, luckily it didn't happen, and on the 21st and 22nd of November 1995, a unanimous jury found Rose guilty of all of the 10 murders she was charged for. Rose was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and she still remains there to this day. She is currently 70 years old and is incarcerated at the HM prison in Newhall. So she's still around. The infamous murder house, 25 Cromwell Street, has since been demolished and turned into a public walkway in October of 1996. And this was done to prevent people from visiting the area just to see the house. It was turning up to be like people were going to visit it for like an amusement or something, and people didn't want that. They didn't want people coming and using it as a tourist attraction, so they did pull the house down. It seems from other pictures that it was those two houses there. You see the brown one on the end is the 25 Cromwell Street, but it's like attached to another one to the left of it, the white one. So I believe they pulled down both of those houses and they made it into like a public walkway. But it seems that people are still visiting the street in general as like a public tourist attraction. I've seen some pictures of people taking selfies with the street sign, which just seems really, you know, insensitive. That stuff makes me really uncomfortable. I don't think you should be treating something like this as some sort of tourist attraction. It's not something to be, you know, like, you shouldn't be excited to go and see this street where all of this horrible stuff happened. So as well, Kitty, if you remember, is Fred's younger sister, who Fred had SA'd and sadly got pregnant when she was a child. She did pass away in 2006. Her husband, Mr. Poole, told reporters that Fred's abuse of her was what actually killed her. He said that the stress of all of the media attention after the crimes were made public caused her to be asked constant, intimate questions by everyone that she came into contact with, and eventually, sadly, led to her death, which is really upsetting. I don't know why people just can't leave them alone. But yeah, apparently that's what led to his sister's eventual death. She was just so innocent of that. The sister, I think, what did we say? She was 13. Was she when Fred SA'd her and actually got her pregnant? And her family, her mother actually stuck up for Fred initially throughout it. It's just awful. So horrible how cruel people can be. Thank you all for taking the time to watch both part 1 and part 2 of this case. I know it was a lot longer than my usual videos, but I do hope that you still enjoyed it. I think it was nice to be able to just cover a lot more information than usual. I feel like usually there's a lot of frustrating gaps which I just can't fill with the available information. This one was so much more in depth, which was so nice for me to be able to do. I promise though, the next case we cover won't be as long as this one. As always, I'd just like to mention that all of my true crime videos are recorded live over on Twitch, so if you want to be one of the first ones to check out the next case, be sure to stop by on Twitch where we will go through it live. You can find the links to this on screen right now or in the video description down below. I would also greatly appreciate if you could give this video a like and subscribe to my channel as well. Also, if you have any comments or case suggestions you'd like me to know about, please make sure you comment them down below too. I love to hear your thoughts and suggestions. I'm going to end today's video here, so thank you very much once again for spending the time to learn about today's case with me. I really appreciate your support a lot. Hopefully I can see you again with another video very soon. Remember to be kind to yourself and others, and hopefully you have a wonderful rest of your day. Goodbye!